What is up, guys? Welcome back to Disclosure Team. I'm your host, Vinny Adams. The following is an interview with Nick Gold. Nick is a former member of the Galileo Project, currently a member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, and the creator of Declassify UAP. In this interview, we discuss Nick's recent attendance for the SCU Conference in Huntsville, Alabama, with keynote speaker Ross Coulthart. We also discuss Nick's work with Declassify UAP and more. If you enjoy this content, please take a second to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, comment down below, and share it with your friends. Thank you for all the ongoing support, and I hope you enjoy this interview with Nick Gold.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. Look at that thing, dude.
American public and global public finally understands UFOs are real.
Non-human, exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed.
Nick, thank you so much for joining me. How's things?
It's great, Vinny, and it's a real pleasure to be here. This is a podcast I've enjoyed for years. I really love your work and appreciate what you bring to UFO world, as I lovingly refer to it. So thank you so much for having me today.
It's my pleasure completely. And we've got a few things that I really want to talk about. You recently attended the SCU Conference, which, you know, I really respect that kind of institute and the organization. And, you know, so it's good to be able to get some input from someone that was there firsthand. But before we do that, I'd just love to get to know a little bit more about yourself. So if you don't mind, would you be able to tell me kind of what got you into the UFO subject?
Well, I'm of that right vintage where in the 80s, when I was in elementary school, I was, bombarded with popular culture that related to the topic. And, that quickly segued into a more serious investigation that really lasted through elementary school and junior high through today. I have to say, I think like the moment was probably, it was at my friend Tommy's 8-year-old birthday party, I believe. We saw Flight of the Navigator in the theater, a classic film on the topic, especially for, kind of family entertainment. And, I was just sort of like instantly, how do I sign up for this? So it really instilled me with that kind of awe around the topic, not so fear oriented, a lot of sort of enthusiasm for exploring the unknown. And, it's funny, I rewatched that movie maybe a year or so ago, and it really holds up well. And I even the early computer graphics that it had, it was an early example of some sophisticated CG work. And just overall, it's interesting. It features transmedium objects. It has time travel that respects time dilation as a concept in a family movie. So, from that moment onward, I think I was hooked and just was devouring books and all of that good stuff.
Amazing. Yeah, it's very similar to me. I was, I think we were of a similar age, and I think we were quite spoiled with some of the science fiction movies of the kind of the 80s and that era. It was, it's certainly not like that today. So yeah, I can really appreciate that. So tell me, like, how did it develop into you actually becoming involved in the subject? Obviously, you have your own organization, Declassify UAP, but so what brought you sort of up into the community, as it were?
It's an interesting question. So, I got involved in the internet from a pretty young age as well. Early teens in the early 1990s, maybe like the 91, 92 timeframe, I was starting to play around with dial-up modems, local bulletin board systems. But we also, I'm from Western Massachusetts, we had a dial-up system at the University of Massachusetts that allowed K-12 students to essentially get a telnet prompt and internet access. And so even as like 14-year-olds, we were telnetting around the internet. We were doing the whole IRC thing, Usenet, mailing lists, the multi-user kind of text-based game environments called MUDs or Muses or Mucks. There was a lot of variations. But so I was talking with people all over the world. I was finding communities of interest online. Again, when my mom really didn't even know what me being in front of the computer meant practically. And, one of the kinds of communities of interest that I was able to locate on the internet, even in the early 90s, is people talking about UFOs or other esoteric topics, of that ilk. And so that gave me kind of a really early opportunity to start plugging into people and communities that took the topic seriously. I mean, some were obviously more conspiratorial than others. But, I remember very specifically, especially once I got to college, I graduated in 2000 from my undergrad, and, 96 to 2000, I was in college. And, I'm about also the same age as John Greenwald from the Black Vault. So that site, when it kind of even was first launching in the mid 90s, around then, I was exposed to that. So getting access to some of the classified documents and all of that, it's just sort of been close to my fingertips because of my internet connectivity for so many decades now. That evolved because I've continued to be online around, internet-based communities of interest on the UFO topic. I've been on Reddit for a good number of years. I spend a little less time there these days. I'm more of an X user now. But, I was on the UFOs group on Reddit and some of the other communities around UAP, UFOs on there. And I remember one day, a few years ago, 2021, Dr. Avi Loeb from Harvard had recently just announced this thing called the Galileo Project that riveted many people who were interested in this, especially with the Harvard Association and taking it seriously. Some familiarity with his work around Oumuamua that had really raised my eyebrow when I was first seeing news reports about this Avi Loeb guy talking about, well, maybe this thing is a techno signature. So Avi had done a Q&A, like an AMA on the UFOs group, again, really weeks, I think, after announcing Galileo Project. And a small number of people kind of reached out to him because, someone had asked, are you trying to do any crowdfunding? Are you going to be promoting this effort, et cetera, et cetera? And he was like, well, I'd be happy to see if there's people who might be able to help with those aspects of the project. And a bunch of people actually ended up reaching out to him. I was one of the first several. And so I kind of made it in through the window where before he was bombarded, and he invited myself and a small handful, maybe about 4 or 5 other folks who kind of came in through that vehicle to join the project. We presented our professional backgrounds. I've been in technology, some kind of marketing side of technology, business world, again, long-term UFO interest, UAP interest. So myself and a handful of others were kind of brought into the public relations team specifically associated with Galileo. After a handful of months, I was sort of elevated and invited by Avi and the group to join the actual research team of the Galileo Project. And so this was my first real opportunity to work with other serious professionals, which of course included trained scientists, engineers, astronomers, physicists, et cetera, around this interest that I've had for so many decades. And it was a great opportunity. I actually was able to contribute a little bit of thinking to the lead Waters et al. Paper that was put out in the Journal of Astronomical Instrumentation, the lead Galileo Project paper. And I contributed a little bit of thinking around terminology, labeling, taxonomy, schemas, ontology, and how that plays into the UAP topic. And I was really proud to have even, a little bit of my thinking included in that, because frankly, that lead paper seems to be the most cohesive paper that defines what a scientific UAP science ought to look like. So that was a great opportunity, getting to meet really serious scientists and engineers who were involved with that. I ended up moving over to the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies after my time with Galileo. I kind of continued in that trend, also coming in to initially assist with some of the public relations efforts. Going back maybe 2 years ago now or so, there was more press releases and reports and things on UAP coming out of the US federal government. And SCU, I encouraged them with a few others, and we worked together around doing this, to put out some press releases kind of in response to these official government statements, congratulating them on things that were clearly represented some progress. Also kind of cajoling them into maybe doing a little more as far as providing actual data with which scientists can start to, make hypotheses, plan out science experiments, further research, et cetera, et cetera. And, try to thread that needle of encouraging the positive side of what the government was starting to acknowledge, but also make sure that they realized that there were serious researchers who knew this topic well, who have some additional expectations that have been building up for the last 3/4 of a century or so. So I helped with that. But, like Galileo in some ways, even though I sort of slipped, through the crack in the door from more of a public relations and communications standpoint initially, I've also been able to help out a little bit around the edges with some of SCU's activities. And there's kind of a nascent project. It hasn't fully formulated yet, but it's going to be around maybe, again, labeling, taxonomy, schemas, and the overall kind of ontologies that those create around the UAP topic. And that was actually sort of my professional background. I did media management systems for many different types of organizations, broadcast, media, government, pop stars, sports teams, newspapers, broadcast networks, you name it. And a lot of the types of systems I put in really had to do with the metadata side, the labeling and taxonomy side of how you build out database systems around things that appear in media. And so that kind of taxonomical background that was always a part of my professional career is now something that we're looking towards doing more with at SCU, as far as, again, like, what are even like the schemas of terminology that we need to even have relating to the UAP topic? There's technical schemas. Some of those are more IT centric. Some of them are instrumentation and science centric. Some of them have to do with the labeling of the phenomena itself. And so I love sort of that sort of top down systemic thinking. It's sort of how my brain works naturally, for better or for worse. So that's more kind of where I'm segueing into with some of my work with SCU right now, is, again, it's thinking through the words and the kind of meaning that they convey, because we're a language-based species, and the words, I believe, that we use to describe things, especially things at the edges of our understanding, are extremely important in kind of how we characterize them and how we think about them. And so it requires a lot of nuance in how you approach that.
It does indeed, an awful lot of nuance. So that's really fascinating. Thank you for that. And before we again get to the SCU conference, tell us about Declassify UAP. What made you kind of want to start it, and its aims and goals?
Absolutely. So everyone can check out declassifyuap.org or other variations, but declassifyuap.org, all one word, is the main domain name for the website that I started about a year ago now, is when it was first coming together. I started building it in early June of 2023. So again, having been involved in the topic for many years, kind of seeing what some of the progress in fits and starts on the governmental side over the last few years was leading to, starting obviously with the New York Times piece and Lou and Chris and others coming out, and kind of this groundswell starting to develop. I've been in the Baltimore, D.C. area for, the last, half of my life now. And a lot of my career was spent in D.C. Again, federal agencies, nonprofits, lobbying groups, some names from all sides of the spectrum that people would be familiar with. I did some work with, even a presidential campaign, political media organizations, you name it. And so when you spend time in DC, especially in kind of the landscape surrounding political or issue-oriented media, you just have a very visceral sense. There's all of these buildings. They often have really pretty, facades and shiny windows, and they're filled with all sorts of people. They could be environmental groups. They could be representing the oil industry or whatever. I mean, and everything. Every issue has these. Every issue has sort of a constellation of these types of organizations that exist to lobby, to get laws passed, to represent sort of the grassroots side of an issue from all different perspectives, frankly. It could be pro-gun, gun safety. Every issue has all of these types of things that exist, specifically to try to kind of enact change on the political front eventually. And what I was seeing with a few others, like Lester Nare with UAP Caucus and Mo with disclosurediaries.com, a great news site, we were seeing like a kind of palpable absence in the nonprofit or legislative or lobbying space around the UAP topic in the way that every other issue has. And so I was like, well, I could attack this from a few different directions. It could be kind of policy wonkish. It could be very grassroots. It could be kind of behind closed doors. It could be more public facing. What reflects this guy the most? And that really is sort of like the grassroots in the trenches. Again, I've been around real people, both in real life and on the interwebs, who are into this topic and interfaced with them directly for decades. So I was like, I'd like to help stand up that org that exists around every other topic that makes it really easy for people to understand, A, I need to be communicating with my elected officials around this UAP topic if I want to see change happen, because people do this with every other type of issue. I need to kind of educate them into kind of being well-informed constituents of their political officials around the UAP topic. And for me, that meant a grounded set of information, a very specifically like official sources, official reports, official quotes, official hearings. Like there's enough in just those materials to kind of open people's eyes, but also keep it very hemmed in. And so I was like, I want to educate them. I want to kind of give them very well articulated ideas about what are we looking for. We can say declassify the topic. What does that even mean? What types of materials would we expect? And how can we create an argument as to why we should expect those? So I have the declassification targets section. And again, I have background information on legislation, some of the officials that are associated with this, some of the reports that have come out over the last several years. But then finally, and this is really one of the big ones, there needs to be that call to action. There needs to be like, here's you, Joe Schmo, Jane Schmo, whoever Schmo, reading the website. I say that lovingly, but just any average person. How can you, in a few moments, communicate to your own elected officials? And the point of Declassify UAP is to do that as a constituent. So your own House district rep, your own 2 senators who represent the state, and of course, the president and vice president. How can I make it so easy, like all those other issue websites, where in a few moments you can fill out a few fields? It's kind of the familiar looking form on that Action Center page on any website for around an issue, and make it so I can just fill these things out, hit a button, and begin that process of engaging with my elected officials as an educated constituent on UAP topics. And so declassifyuap.org/action, which I hope everyone watching this right now is just kind of going to in the background, because you'll be done in 30 seconds. You fill out a few fields. It sends a very kind of sober-minded, grounded message to your own elected officials, from your House rep all the way to the President of the United States, and communicates some of the main pressing items of the moment that, again, are really rooted in the actual political processes that are unfolding now. Specific bills that we're trying to get passed, like the UAP Disclosure Act that was introduced by Schumer and Rounds last year, the Safe Airspace for Americans Act that ASA and Ryan Graves have been lobbying around and kind of putting some energy into trying to get passed. So when you send that message through declassifyuap.org/action, you fill it out, you hit send. You've now sent kind of your own little checklist to your own officials, and it says, I'd like a written response on these specific points, and you will get a response from your officials after some amount of time. It may be good, it may not be good, it may be informed, it may barely even, if at all, even relate to UAP. And people get a variety of different types of answers depending on who their reps are. But you can begin that process and kind of say, well, I asked for this. Did they actually tell me if they support that law? Did they tell me, do they even seem to know about that law? Are they on a relevant committee where they really ought to be following this a little closer because they're on armed services, they're on intel, something like that, oversight. So that's like the beginning of the process. The hope was that this starts to get people in the practice of communicating more regularly with their elected officials, ideally through other mechanisms as well. We have a call tool. So you can toggle over to the little phone icon on declassifyuap.org/action, and it gives you a call script, some talking points, so you can call the DC office of your own elected officials and reiterate some of these points, ideally as a follow-up to that message you sent. And so if you send the message, maybe you hear something back in a few weeks, maybe you don't. Really, regardless, you should call back, call that DC number that we give you, at least reiterate some of those key points around major pieces of legislation. And we are heading into this sort of UAP legislation season now, because we know that things that are kind of UAP related, especially on the Senate side now, that are going to probably get introduced for potential inclusion in this year's National Defense Authorization Act or Intelligence Authorization Act, they end up getting folded together. But that stuff is going to be introduced in the next few weeks, probably, maybe 30 days or so, if last year's timing holds, which it probably will. And will get voted on towards the end of the year in this murky reconciliation process, which may or may not lead to those things making it into the final law. But what I would hope is that people really start to get into that communication process with their officials now. I also just want to plug Lester's website because it's very complimentary. It was informed by much of the same thinking as my own. Lester and I are very simpatico, as well as his colleague Ronak, who I've worked with from the beginning as well. And their tool set is a little different in that it gives you a call tool and information that's all of the same ilk, but for a broader set of congressional representatives who are somehow associated with the UAP issue. They've attached themselves to it. They have an interest. They've been introducing legislation or supporting legislation. Or maybe they're just on certain committees that put them in an important position for, say, moving forward some of the legislation that's being introduced around UAP. So I like to recommend that people certainly do declassifyuap.org, start engaging with your reps through that, and then also use uapcaucus.com/call, Lester's tool set and website, to kind of create that louder hum of noise around the issue so the reps understand, like, this is national. This is like a lot of people are paying attention. They're well informed. They know how I'm personally relevant. They might not be in my district, but like they've got their eyes on me. I mean, they might be able to fundraise against me if I'm not doing the things, even though they're not in my district. So both tool sets are really useful in this process. And hopefully people can kind of do multiple communications with their reps and other key reps between now and November, December timeframe. At a few key phases, we will keep informing folks of like, now's a good time to call. These are the things to be saying. These are the bills to be supporting today. And more will be coming clear again just in the next few weeks. So please, folks, declassifyuap.org, get involved. This is huge. The stuff that Lou and Chris Mellon and Carl Nell and Gary Nolan and all these other folks are doing kind of from a top-down insider perspective are critical, absolutely critical, and it's why we're here today. We need to kind of rise up as the grassroots, that ground swelling of support for what they've started to do and the changes that they've started to influence. And we need to show our political representatives the public supports this. You, my rep, have political capital to trade because your constituents support you on this. We're voicing that. It's not going to be like, oh, I'm going to get myself into trouble by starting to get involved with the UAP topic. We're here to tell you we want you to do that, and you're good to do that. So, this is a big problem, so to speak, the whole UFO situation. So we need to come at it from as many sides as possible. And so that's really the ground up is what Declassify UAP, UAP Caucus, the new UAP disclosure fund that we're doing some coordinating with. All of it together is what I think is going to make additional change happen. I think we're already like a good chunk into the change. We have a few more years. I think there's going to be some big wins. But we've also got to celebrate the wins that we've already gotten over the last few years. There's been some big ones.
That has indeed. I completely agree. And I will just reiterate to everybody watching this on YouTube or listening to it on your selected podcast platform, I will make sure that all the links are in the description of the video, the audio that Nick has just mentioned, because it really does make a difference. And we have had feedback in the past 6-12 months from individuals who have spoken to staffers and people on the Hill, and they do see what we're doing and it's making a difference. So yeah, just to reiterate those points.
No question. And I'll just say, when I called Rounds' office at one point last year, there was a few times, but I spoke to one of the folks right when a lot of people were making UAP calls. And the guy I spoke with on the phone said, we've never had this volume of calls on any piece of legislation that we've supported before. Like, he was pretty blown away. And we just got to keep that going and keep it building, because that's a huge light flashing on their dashboard. Like, oh crap, the UFO light is now flashing in bright red, increasingly quickly. Like, we've got to put some time and energy into this. And so it's working, as you said.
Absolutely, man. Great work. Keep it up. So listen, let's get to the SCU conference. I think this happened kind of a couple of weeks ago. We also had Contacts in the Desert, two very different types of kind of UFO conference. So I guess my first question would be, what do you think, or what do you see as something that sets the SCU conference aside from your everyday kind of UFO conference?
It's a great question. And, it's, I think, a little unfortunate that they were scheduled really on the same several days. In the future, I hope that doesn't happen because there's value to what both conferences bring, the types of speakers that appear at both conferences, frankly, the type of audiences who are attracted to both conferences. I really believe in cross-pollination. So, contact in the desert has been a thing for a while. And I think it's fair to say this, and I don't say it disparagingly. Again, I was involved with this side of UFO world for decades, from childhood up through today. There's been like the conference set for UFO world. There's been the radio shows, whether it's Art Bell and Coast to Coast and what that's evolved into, and now some other ones that are pretty prominent out there. So that kind of public interest, which also intersects with kind of the experiencers, as a lot of people now describe themselves, contactees, as it might have once been known. People who either see a UAP or have a more visceral interpersonal type of experience that they associate with the topic. Contact in the desert, and with the word contact right in it, is the kind of event that I think brings in a lot of the people who have those experiences and impressions and have been doing the research for decades. And it's all over the map. And I mean, there are some certainly more scientific, minded people at Contact in the Desert, but there's also things for experiencers, and it's more of that kind of multi-decade now, UFO scene, so to speak, embodied in an actual event, which is great. SCU is a little different in that it's really almost exclusively oriented around scientific and associated engineering efforts specific to UAP research, with the goal in mind of putting out papers, having them get peer reviewed, whether they're self-released through SCU, whether things end up getting accepted by other organizations like AIAA, which has accepted a couple of SCU papers, potentially journal publications that could present peer-reviewed papers on the UAP topic. That's the realm. It's a narrower realm that the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies and its anomalous aerospace phenomena conference. It's always a mouthful there. But it's really aimed at that. And so when you see a talk at SCU, there's probably a science project, like an actual, set of experiments and observations or whatever that's associated with someone's presentation. Other types of more kind of baseline scientific research on the topic that's relevant, even around people's impressions of the topic, but how that informs how it needs to be studied. It could be people presenting an actual paper that they've put out, and kind of presenting a paper in a more formal sense that you see in more academic science, engineering, or industry-specific kind of conferences. So SCU has kind of got that blinders on to using the scientific process as much as possible to clarify what's up with UAP and associated topics. So it's a little more formal in that sense. However, it still attracted an interesting variety of people, and not just the scientists, engineers, professionals. That itself overlaps with people who have seen UAP, people who have had other types of outlier experiences that, again, might be lumped in with the topic. So all of those people are represented, but it's just, you've got a lot of great scientists there, working scientists, academics, people who've been researching this thoroughly for decades. And, I'll almost say this, and I think there's some literal truth to it, but it's also kind of a way people can think about an org like SCU. SCU was formed, I think, in 2017 when some folks who were part of MUFON for many years decided to break off from that organization for several, probably very good reasons, and created a new org, again, with the focus on scientific research and exploration of the topic. What SCU does, if anyone's ever heard of like the secret or the invisible college that Valet talked about, a group of professionals, serious professionals, scientists, engineers, academics who studied UAP for decades kind of in the shadows, or groups like the Aviary, which were sort of similar and maybe had some overlap. Frankly, SCU has some people who are involved in those groups, but it's now doing it out in the open because they can do it out in the open, and they don't necessarily risk their professional reputations doing it out in the open, which is huge. Like, that's major progress that someone who used to have to present in closed circles under, this shadowy UFO group can now just go on stage, put it out, release a paper, their real name is on it. They have a job with some aerospace firm or something. Like, I can't even express how much progress that represents. I mean, I told you I was a little kid into this. one of the biggest things I always wanted to see as a little kid is, why can't people just research this? This seems so worthy of basic exploration. So between, Galileo, SCU, some of these other groups doing this, it's just wonderful to see that level of expertise applied to it in this open fashion. So just a huge, huge charge off of that kind of an environment for someone like me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm sure there were a lot of great speakers there as well. But, one notable was the keynote speaker with Ross Coulthart this year. So, please, by all means, let me know if there was anything that Ross said that really stood out to you. And again, any of the other sort of speakers and information that was kind of given, please let me know any sort of standouts for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can give a little summary. I have my crib sheet, and all of them made quite a bit of impact, frankly. I mean, I was pretty blown away at the overall quality of the event from the moment I came in. It's held at this specific kind of like restaurant that has like event space built into it in Huntsville, Rocket City. Huge heart of aerospace and space development has been there. The reason it's there is because both it attracts some of that audience who have professional lives around those areas of industry who are also interested in UAP, and it makes it easy for them to get to. And that includes even like Rich Hoffman, one of the heads of SCU on the SCU board, who's local to that area. So you get here. It's just you guys for several days. So it's like everyone in that building, other than the staff, who were great, by the way, they really took care of us. You're just in that wonderful little pocket of that world, which doesn't necessarily feel like your day-to-day life, but you're like, oh, for a few days, I'm in my zone here. So, Rich started it off, and I'm going to actually skip to the end. When Rich gave his closing statement, I hope he doesn't, feel awkward about me saying this. He got a little emotional, but I think a lot of people did. He was so proud of how the event transpired, the type of people, the type of presentations, how well we were treated by the venue and the venue staff and the lead chef who runs the restaurant. Like, it is moving to be in that environment and feel stigma has kind of melted away. You're in just the realm of people who take this seriously. They might not all be on the same page, but we all agree that there is something to this. It's very much worthy of study, and we should be both open-minded and discerning as we approach it. So, Rich started things off. The whole event was actually sort of emceed or kind of guided by Micah Hanks. This was a little bit of a change from previous years. Micah hadn't done that before. I thought he was excellent. He set just an amazing tone. I love his work. It was great to get to know him a little bit over a few days in person, even over a few beers at one point or two. And I thought he brought a fantastic energy. He's also just very charismatic and well-spoken. And so it really kind of added this air of sort of seriousness to the event. And it was very well produced. SCU has it streamed out. You can attend it in real time, which I really recommend to people. The talks will be put online in probably several months for more people to see. However, if you want to support UAP science, some of that involves this stuff. So even if you're a general member of the public next year, I think they might just do it online next year. They kind of do it every other year in person / online, and then it's just online one year to keep it a little easier. Consider signing up for it. Pay the $100 or whatever bucks it is to join, and they can, I think, potentially, if you're a student especially, subsidize that a little bit if you need a little help. But supporting UFO science, UAP science means supporting it. So it's well produced, and people can participate online. People are chatting with each other online. So there's like a professional camera crew, and then out comes Ross Coulthart, right? One of the personalities around the topic these days. I love his book In Plain Sight. He's a strong voice on many levels, for the topic as an advocate, and he gave what really ended up being a, for the most part, blow the house down kind of keynote opening address. And let me touch on just a few points. So Ross clearly was speaking to the need and support for doing scientific inquiry around the topic. However, that wasn't the exact angle he was attacking, because he's not a scientist of UAP science. He's an investigative journalist. He dives into it. He certainly can can keep up with some of the science and stuff like that. But it was broader than that. It was almost a call to arms, if I can say so, in that he was saying this is legitimate. He kind of summarized a lot of his involvement with the topic, what he's learned. He presented some allegations that he's privy to. He didn't necessarily say these are all absolutely truth or what's going on, but even just the backdrop of things he's privy to with some of his sources only lends credence to the seriousness and legitimacy of the underlying topic. But I'd say the bulk of his talk really focused on democracy and democratic process, and how the failure of especially the U.S. federal government, to address the issue maturely for many decades now is a failure of our institutions and a failure of democracy functioning as it at least was supposed to work, as it was originally envisioned. And I think we all can have little debates about, the nuances of that conversation, but I can tell you that the vast majority of people in attendance were sort of like that old RCA ad with the guy back in the seat or whatever, the hair getting blown back. Like, it was really quite powerful. And I agree. I mean, again, it was the motivating principle in many ways for declassifyuap.org. It's like, people need to get involved. And when certain things in our government don't function right, yeah, we've got to attack it from the insiders and the whistleblowers and the investigations, but the public is also a major part of that. And I love that Ross is incorporating that messaging into some of his overall messaging and what he communicated in that event. Like, no one's going to save us from our government not functioning other than us being involved and demanding it and doing the actions that, again, people take around every other issue when they don't feel the government is serving them properly, and actually take advantage of the mechanisms that our system really does provide. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but it's like, you got to do this. And his way of delivering that was just very powerful. Now, I heard feedback from a couple people. I'd say this is more representative of the quieter UFO science type, who were like, well, that strayed a little afar from UFO science. This is a UFO science conference. And I myself I was like, well, a keynote speaker at an event doesn't have to be emblematic of the primary focus of even that organization. I mean, all sorts of professional orgs have some Hollywood actor come in to give a keynote. Like, this was much more on topic than something like that. And I liked that the keynote was broader in its nature. And I'm going to refer to my crib sheet here because the theme of the conference this year was called Bridging the Gap, bringing science, government, and academia together to better understand UAP. And, Ross really plugged into that vein that I think Rich and the other SCU board members were really trying to espouse. This needs to be attack the problem from all angles kind of thing. And the more cohesive we can be in doing that, the more successful we're going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, aside, obviously, you mentioned there Ross being the keynote. I'm assuming I wasn't able to attend virtually, so I didn't sort of get to see sort of the meat and potatoes of what was discussed from the other speakers, but I'm assuming it was more sort of science focused.
Absolutely. Again, I've got my other crib sheet here because there were so many talks. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 12 different presentations, depending on how you slice and dice. And again, they were all oriented around a very specific set of science research. I mean, I can just kind of quickly go through with just some of my gross thinking. Julia Mossbridge, Julia, some folks will know because she is a researcher in outlier phenomena, if you want to call it that broadly. This could be so-called psi or sort of psychic things, remote viewing, incorporates UAP and other things like that now. And she's a researcher that has been doing this in a really serious way academically for a while now. And she had a really interesting presentation that really started off the first main day, Saturday, working with taboo and fear. What does cognitive neuroscience teach us? And so, she was addressing head on the stigma in many ways, as was the next talk I'll get to in a second. And, when there are so many stigmas baked into a topic that you want to approach seriously, but the topic itself has some outlier aspects, how does one do that? And how does one do that in a way that brings about progress and over time really just minimizes the stigma so we can really get to work on this? And I'll just say this, her overriding kind of like main theme was love. Like she used that word a bunch of times. Like love needs to sort of be a central motivator for how we think about ourselves as we investigate outlier areas, kind of a self-love, love for the topic, love for others even when they don't agree with us or even when they're attacking us. That kind of loving spirit, and not, obviously not romantic love we're talking here. We're talking about a unifying kind of spirit that brings us together as people or even with nature or whatever. It needs to sort of be there fueling our ability to work through the bumps, the peaks and the valleys of this type of an exploration. And multiple people referred to her talk throughout the next couple of days because I think it's not necessarily what a more grounded materials science physicist type person is thinking of as they're reviewing this or that or an experiment or cell biology or whatever. But it's a really refreshing perspective to have breathed in, especially when a kind of scary, more outlier topic is what people are being charged with trying to take seriously. And it made just a big impact on people. That was kind of followed up by Dr. Kevin Knuth, who people are familiar with. He's one of the key members of UAPX. He had a really fascinating talk. Again, I was blown away by all of them. But his, I'll give you the title. It was Science and the Mishandling of Anomalies. And this was actually something we talked about a lot when I was with Galileo Project. Anomaly is what we're talking about here. And science doesn't handle anomaly very well, traditionally. Things that are outliers to our current models. And I think it was Kevin, I believe it was Kevin who incorporated in his talk, he was talking about our discovery of microorganisms, which is an analog that I love to bring up all the time relating to the UAP topic, because it's teeny versus broad, but it really seems analogous in so many ways. And so he was talking about like the way we learned there was these invisible things everywhere was in childbirth. Now, this is a fascinating notion that midwives who were delivering babies outside of more medical environments had cultural knowledge to wash their hands before delivering a child. Yet the medical establishment, which didn't have that cultural know-how, was killing mothers and babies because they didn't know about the invisible stuff everywhere. They took that, it was just totally out of their vision. And because they didn't have some other knowledge set to fall back on, like cultural knowledge, which is legitimate, even if it's not scientifically validated necessarily, it can still be based on what's real, because reality is a bigger category than what's been scientifically validated, right? So, the midwives were delivering more babies healthily, the mothers were healthy, and the doctors were killing people. And they had to look at it and be like, yeah, they're washing their hands. What could that mean? Why would that affect anything? Like, again, no awareness that there's these invisible critters everywhere. So, he was talking about how anomaly is often really tough, especially when you're locked in the rigors of some kind of scientific dogma that says, especially, only the things that we have scientifically validated are real. Reality is defined by what we know within this particular domain. If it's outside of it, we might as well treat it as it's totally imaginary. And I think what Dr. Knuth was really getting at is we have to broaden our view, especially at a very nascent early stage of the scientific investigation of a topic, because it's totally normal for scientific investigations to be initially informed by subjective experiences, by people seeing things, meteorites falling out of the sky. There's rocks coming from the sky. Science had no place to put that when it was originally being alleged. So he talked a lot about we have to understand that when we don't know so much about the nature of Earth, the solar system, the planet, the galaxy, all of it, space travel, what's possible, the prevalence of life in in star systems, all of it, when there's so many unknowns, we can't make assumptions about the likelihood. Some skeptics like Michael Shermer, they love using the word Bayesian, like to speak of Bayesian statistics. Bayesian statistics is all based on the priors that you assign to certain probabilities to make additional probability statements. When you don't really have any priors to work from, you can't be very limiting artificially and say, well, this is completely off the table when you really don't know what those priors are. And I think that's a message we just got to signal so much more. Like, we don't have enough of even the basic understanding. I mean, just look at how many exoplanets we've discovered in the last few years in the habitable zones, starting to detect some atmospheric signatures with things like James Webb that are like, oh, that's interesting. Another couple of generations, who knows what we'll have discovered. So we've just got to be really grounded in our lack of knowledge and our willingness to take on anomalies with eyes wide open, because that's where it might represent kind of high risk, but there's also the high reward side to that. So I thought that was fantastic. We got an update on some of the database work that SCU is going to be doing and has already begun. Whether this will end up being a competitor or supplant or incorporate the data sets of things like MUFON, NUFORC, other data gathering activities and projects around UAP sightings specifically. SCU is building a front end. It can import other data sets, or it can potentially take in net new case reports. And it's just got a great graphical front end, a lot of more contemporary database functionalities, a lot of extensibility built in. And it's great to have an org like SCU that doesn't have issues around it for a variety of reasons, whether they're potential commercial issues, just long-term organizational issues from maybe even decades that people are a little squeamish around, something that just is sustainable probably for the longer term. It's great to see that SCU is exploring that space, and I think that'll be a very useful tool set. The next presentation was great. So Dr. Joshua Pearson is an active member of the defense realm, and he is an SCU member, and he presented a paper on applying the approaches of intelligence analysis to the UAP problem and how that can frame out additional scientific work on the topic. And I loved his talk. There's one part I didn't like, and Josh has probably heard me say this now. He said, we should kind of forget about declassifying things. They're never going to do it. I was like, wait a minute. You're talking to here, right? So, I think he was more saying there's a lot of challenges with getting a very overclassification-oriented DoD and intelligence community to open the files. We have to kind of also take some other approaches. That's how I choose to interpret what he was saying. But I really love Josh's presence. I've talked with him a bit on the SU Slack and such. I might be actually doing that schema development project with a family member of his who's potentially going to be involved. So his talk I found riveting, because here you have an active member of the defense community who did his thesis on UAP and can apply how the people of that realm think about solving problems, especially when there isn't a ton of data on hand at this point. And it's like, it felt almost like you were getting a little bit of a secret view. And I'm not saying this is what was happening. I want to be really clear. I'm not saying Josh was, somehow exemplifying what's happening specifically in a secret realm, and he's one of those. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying his sensibilities and his training and his background and his active duty status, it was a wonderful way of sort of elucidating, clarifying how people in that realm attack these hard, challenging, but ultimately technical challenges and problems. And so, he talked about, how we would use the kind of reports that have been out in the public for years and years, and some of the nascent, government reports that have been coming out in the last few years to start to inform that more scientific approach for gathering hard data on the topic so we can learn more about it. And I just felt it was very powerful. I thought it was great to have someone from that realm working with the SCU realm, and this being kind of simpatico. One of the reasons I wanted to attend in person, I was like, well, in 2022, Grush showed up and was introduced for the first time to some other key people that led to Grush even being a public personality and testifying and all of that stuff. So I was like, I'm sure there's just some interesting folks who show up at the SCU conference in person. And, in many ways, again, I'm not saying he was associated with those programs. I don't think he was or whatever. But again, Joshua gave a really great view into that world that I think is frankly useful for a lot of people in UAP world. For sometimes the right reasons, people have conspiratorial views about how the government has treated the UAP issue, because there actually seemingly have been conspiracies around the UAP topic in governance and DOD and IC. But I love this evolution where, again, an open broadcast to the internet circles under people's real names, doing a doctoral thesis on UAP as a member of the DoD community, what that says about the progress we're making. I thought it was huge and very powerful. And then on Saturday, the last update was Dr. Matt Zadegas, who people know through UAPX. He was giving some updates on the UAPX project. People who might have watched A Tear in the Sky are familiar with some of that work. And I've gotten to know Matthew as well through some of like just SCU, more social, video chats and stuff like that over the last couple of years. And I find that he has a really down to earth approach to this stuff. Like, one of the things he was addressing is some of the things that UAPX initially thought might be outlier or anomalous in the data that they had gathered in that specific several day period turned out to not be, but you have to go through that process. You have to look at potential anomalies. You have to rule out all of the other things that they can be to come up with, okay, well, these are the leftovers. If there are any, let's put our main focus and energy into those, and let's figure out why they stand out versus the things we're able to rule out. And does that allow us to characterize anomalies better so we can look for them a little more specifically? So I always enjoy his updates about where UAPX is with that. They do have one piece of data that still to them stands out, and they have not been able to kind of correlate with the equipment or something else in the environment. And so they are still looking at that data set. But I just thought it was a really, honest view into sort of like the slightly less pretty side of how science actually functions, because it's not going to be, there's a UFO, there's a UFO, there's a UFO. It's like we've got days worth of data we need to pour through. There's going to be sort of like the big bucket that we throw interesting stuff into initially, and not everything is going to stay in that bucket. And I think that's a message, especially people who are interested in the topic a little more casually or without a scientific or engineering background, need to hear, because sometimes, and I'll get to this in just a moment, some things stick out to us and we think, oh my goodness, what's that? And they can indeed turn out to be a little more mundane. And we need to be aware of that. And it doesn't mean that there aren't highly anomalous, apparently technological UAP flying around or whatever. So I'll just go through the last few. Sunday, some folks will be familiar with Dr. Beatriz Villarreal. I got to meet her when I was with Galileo Project. She's been involved with the Vasco project. And so, Beatriz, as people will maybe know, did some very fascinating work around these old astronomical photographic plates that show these transients, or what sometimes were referred to as disappearing stars in some coverage. Although the ones that she focused on sort of appeared and then disappeared in brief windows of time, like within an hour of these several images of the same spot in space being photographed, something wasn't there, then it shows up, and then it goes away again. Well, these plates were done before we had any satellites flying around. So it wasn't a satellite, and it wasn't indicative of the kind of other stuff you just might happen to catch. And some of them were in straight lines, and some of them were in groups. And so that kind of spawned a lot of her interest in the UAP topic, actually. And she came into Galileo Project and has done some other work since and is building on that work. And so she also spoke to a new project, which is fascinating, that she's going to be involved with. And they're starting to specify equipment now, instrumentation. And this is, shocker, to stand up some telescopes and look for UAP, which... It's like a no-brainer, right? But but people need to still do it, and very few people are actually doing it. And she's got a project around it, and they're getting some funding, and they're buying some nice grade telescopes. So instead of relying on a very specific set of old photographic plates, they can try to create some new data sets and look for the types of transients that don't correlate with expected astronomical stuff, like, again, human-made satellites or other space junk or other things. I mean, people have seen rocket boosters coming back or in orbit thinking that they were UAP. So you have to filter all that out. You have to obviously filter out the kind of transient but expected astronomical events, meteorites, stuff like that. But there's ways to characterize stuff that don't fall into those categories easily. And unless you look for it, which Galileo is to some degree and other projects are, but unless you look for it, we're not going to find it. And she's just a wonderful public UAP science communicator broadly. And to have her kind of spearheading a lot of those efforts right now, I think is an extraordinarily powerful thing for people who are interested in UAP science. So that work could be over the next years, but even for it to kind of officially begin is a really huge issue. And, it actually kind of doesn't overlap totally with Galileo, because Galileo project, at least initially, their instrumentation is not telescope focused. It's really looking at the closer atmospheric environment using cameras and stuff like that. So the fact that a different UAP science project will also be using telescopes is huge. It's like, people do see things, do weird stuff in the sky that does not seem satellite-like, does not seem, space junk-like. It doesn't seem, like a meteorite, the way these things can move. So it's like, thank goodness someone's looking at this point and going to be recording it. And maybe we'll find some interesting stuff, because you're not going to find it if you don't look.
Exactly.
So just a couple more, Doug Bittner and Nick Snell. This is an important one. And again, it gets to the if we want to take the scientific investigation of this topic seriously, we have to be open to finding things that we initially think are anomalous and then learn through investigation may not be. So Doug is one of the folks, and he's like an aerospace engineering type guy. And, serious guy, university affiliations, and he's taken UAP science seriously for a long time. But one of the things he wanted to look at were Starlink reports and Starlink sightings that were potentially misreported as UAP sightings. Now, this is a little sensitive in some ways for people who are among UFO world. Again, I wear that badge proudly, because, there were, and this was really over the last 6 months to a year especially, a string of sightings of interesting aerial, often nighttime phenomena by a number of airline pilots of things that looked like objects making certain types of patterns that did not, comport with what they expected and their whole training and careers expected them to see in the sky. And very early, certain figures, including controversial figures like Mick West, were like, it's Starlink, and presented some arguments for that. But arguments that I think a lot of people from certain quarters are a little more, hesitant in accepting, especially when they're presented in such a black and white, they're all this kind of way.
Sure, yeah.
Done to a large degree. So thankfully, we have folks like Doug looking at this with more nuance, and with an acknowledgement that sometimes people see actually highly anomalous things, but not always, and sometimes things are misreported. And UAP researchers have known this for decades. It's only 3 to 20%, maybe, depending on which study or whatever, of UAP reports, largely, broadly, really end up looking like there's something unexplainable when you look at all of the possible things that they could have been. And, it's a relatively small percentage, still a very meaningful number. But Doug looked at these sightings and looked at Starlink and tried to kind of correlate, is this uptick in airline pilot and crew UAP reports actually Starlink? And he was able to confirm that indeed some highly trained aviators are seeing what is a new aerial phenomena. Lots of frickin' Starlink satellites in the sky. This is people don't realize it's so many more satellites being launched into space just for Starlink by Elon Musk that it almost dwarfs all the other satellites we've ever put up there. And they make glints, and you can see them in the sky at times. And because there's so many, and because of just the way, how bright they are, they do look different than a lot of other satellites seen in the sky. And so, Dr. Bittner was able to confirm that indeed some of these sightings do correlate to Starlink trains or individual satellites or places in the sky where, again, because there's so many Starlink satellites even in one little zone, it might look like it's one thing moving around, but it's actually like a whole train of satellites coming through periodically. And it's a new kind of phenomena. And his main point, and it's an important one, it kind of looks like FAA was behind the curve in properly educating airline pilots about this whole new aerial phenomena that they might see with some regularity that looks new and strange in many circumstances. And to be very aware of that from a training perspective, because it can negatively affect a pilot's ability to operate with the same level of full situational awareness as they normally would when there's this weird flashing light thing going on out of the corner of your eye that's hard to avoid, especially because you don't know what it is and it could represent something you have to be mindful of as a pilot. So that research is critical because I think it inspires, FAA and other bodies like AIAA to really be honest that sometimes these UAP sightings end up being even a net new aerial phenomena that is worthy of some education and training in its own right. And they need to kind of stay ahead of the curve with that stuff. And when we're putting tens of thousands of Starlink satellites, and then there's a few other networks that are going to be coming online over the next few years, there's going to be many more opportunities for people to see kind of strange looking aerial occurrences. And if they don't have that training in place and there isn't an open, honest discussion about those kind of things coming online and how you might interact with them as a pilot, say, it could really cause some real problems, and not just visceral problems. It frankly causes problems for the study of UAP because you want to be able to rule out the stuff that isn't necessarily worthy of quite as much focus, or you want to quickly be able to look at a pilot report and have a methodology for determining if Starlink was a likely source or any other kind of satellite or typical human engineered aerial phenomena. So I think that kind of work is critical, and people who are doing that work in the context of UFO science, I think, kind of need to be celebrated. It's not just an attack on legitimate UFOs. Like Dr. Bittner knows, in my experience, he knows that that's also a thing. But you got to be able to weed that out. And I'll just say this. Dr. Bittner was also involved with a little bit of research associated with that fairly recent video that one or two people from an airliner over New York took of this kind of black lozenge kind of looking thing. It almost looked a little metallic. And Doug, did some work, and his hypothesis is that this is probably a black zero party balloon. And so we actually did an experiment. It was raining a lot when I was down in Huntsville, but there was this one like kind of nice moment. I think it was on Sunday afternoon, and he actually brought the balloon that he thinks was probably the same or very similar to the one that was in that video based on his initial hypothesis. And we ran an experiment in the parking lot because what he didn't have, the person who photographed it had a regular iPhone 12. And Apple does not publish the field of view in degrees of all of their cameras. They actually do it with their wide camera because they're kind of bragging about the field of view you get. But when it's the main onboard camera, they don't give you that technical piece of data. So we did a little research. We looked at all the original metadata from the video that was shot by that person. We figured out that I happen to have an iPhone 12 Pro, but the main camera on the regular 12 and the 12 Pro are the same module, the same sensor by all appearances. Like Apple gets that camera for both models from the same manufacturer. So my iPhone 12 Pro was technically capable of shooting a video with the same lens and sensor setup as what she had when shooting this thing from her iPhone 12 out of an airplane window coming in over Manhattan, right? So we were able to calculate, we were able to do a couple of things. First, because he had this balloon and he knew how wide it was, and we had a long tape measure, over 100 feet out, and we were doing different measurements and increments. I was shooting with that same setup, again, using a 12 Pro, but using the main camera. And he's able to now calculate the actual field of view in degrees because we have a known object from which to base those calculations. We also found that balloon, at the distance that he had initially predicted, even before doing this experiment, looks like exactly what she had in her video. I can't say that definitively means it was a zero black party balloon. There's just no definitive data that will ever come out. It does seem to indicate that Doug's hypothesis is highly valid as a hypothesis because, again, it even confirmed his assumptions about some of those measurements. And it really does look like what she saw. And the last thing he's now having to resolve is how quickly it was apparently moving, which was like very fast. But a balloon that gets picked up into the lower atmosphere and is getting sucked into a jet's wake or something, it can move a balloon really quickly through the sky, and then the aircraft itself is moving quickly. So, that's probably explainable. But it was fun to like do a UFO science experiment at the conference, and it was cool that I just happened to have the right older iPhone that correlated to what we needed. And we ended up looking at my metadata from my recording, and it all matched up. So, those assumptions seem to bear out. So just the final little bit from the SCU conference that I'll go over with you, Vinny, is that SCU itself does UAP science and has different working groups that have put out different papers. I really encourage people watching this to check out the SCU website. It's Explore SCU for the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, explorescu.org. If you go to the website, and there's a library link at the top in the main nav bar. The SCU library has a couple types of items, all of which should be interesting to people watching this right now. One is that they do a regular newsletter, which has updates on their research, has some slightly more fun articles, stuff that might be a little more topical to something that's been going on in the last month or two in UFO research. But in addition, there's all these papers that SCU puts out. So the last presentation, or at least the last main presentation, was sort of some updates on these SCU papers and work that had happened. And, for instance, there's this UAP characterizations study that Robert Powell was one of the leads on. Sounds nutty. Not too many papers out there over the decades just doing kind of meta-level analysis on what are people actually seeing and reporting when they talk about UFO or UAP sightings. What do they look like? Sound? Are there electromagnetic signatures? What are their kinematics or movement profiles through space? Space, but I mean physical space, the atmosphere typically. There's very little science that just like puts that all together and says, by the way, when we're talking about UAP, this is what we mean, which is key and gets back to some of like what I take really seriously, the terminology that we use. UFO, UAP, these are anti-labels. They don't tell us what we're looking at. They tell us that we're not looking at all the other stuff. They don't actually characterize or describe what we're talking about. They don't even create a new category for things with certain attributes. So one of the things I loved about this work that they provided an update on, and the paper has been out for a little while now, is that we really do need to have a compendium of the types of objects or lights and their movements or whatever. So instead of UAP meaning potentially anything in the sky someone doesn't recognize, that might be a little weird, or a plane in the distance that I can't fully resolve. I can like assume it's a plane, but I'm not like it's a dot, but it's probably a plane because it's where all those other planes are coming into my airport or whatever. But like, people have pushed back against UFO people over the world and been like, well, is that, it's unidentified. Sure, it's a UFO. And it's like, no, we actually mean a set of specific things when we use these terms. So having a paper to reference, that goes back even I think as late as the late 40s in Project Sign and over the decades, and then it looks at even like Arrow and their shape categories that they've put out. Turns out UFO UAP it's a variety of things, but it's a pretty consistent and like easy to wrap your head around set of things. And it's important for us to say this is actually what those terms mean when we use it this way. We're not using it generically. We're not describing seagulls or weather balloons. Like they look like this, they move like this, they might sound like this, they have these other signatures. And the good news is it's a little bit of progress out of Aero. Aero's actually provided some of those metrics to us in some of their reports. They have that whole data slide, which is actually hugely significant and hasn't been paid attention to enough, in my opinion. But they're like, these are the shapes. Here's a pie chart. Here's a little table of some of these even anomalous characteristics that Aero is acknowledging exist. Up to Mach 2 with no thermal exhaust. That's not typical. So, even Aero is acknowledging some of those anomalous characteristics. Then there was just a couple other papers. There's like kind of work around UAP intentions. Again, this is obviously using more intelligence analysis techniques to try to glean intentions simply from a set of behaviors. Larry Hancock, who's a many-decade UFO researcher, very grounded, probably one of our best resources for military UFO encounter information out there, and a great guy, just really fun to talk to and a real resource for all of us. He started with looking at kind of UAP that were clustered around various US military nuclear type programs, and what can you actually glean when you go into more detail, not just saying there seems to be some nexus between UAP and nukes. Well, let's look at specific programs, new types of nuclear programs, new types of nuclear technologies, and how do UAP sightings around those kind of more specific mile markers start to convey possible intentions as it relates to that. And they're going to be broadening this and look at kind of even what public interactions with UAP might indicate as far as intentions go. And I think that's useful because when you don't have all the details to do full scientific analyses, it doesn't mean, like Josh Pearson was saying, doesn't mean you don't have techniques that are still often used by various serious-minded people to understand the nature of our world. And intelligence gathering is sort of more where we're at now with understanding UAP than hard material sciences, especially in the public domain. Those are obviously starting based on what we've talked about today, but I think it's always good for orgs like SCU to also consider those other techniques, especially because those might be more kind of early stage, and analyzing that stuff from an intelligence framework may actually provide ideas about how to then evolve that into a more rigorous scientific set of methodologies for building on that work. So all in all, it wrapped up. Rich was a little moved. We were all a little moved. It was just such a wonderful event. And then, you're meeting so many great folks, people online, people you've talked to, people whose work you really appreciate, but you've never even really exchanged words. People were staying up too late, myself included, having a couple of beers. And those types of events, I think, are, like all professional conferences that people might go to, those kind of offline moments in many ways are, as big a part of the experience as the formal talks and presentations and Q&A periods. So all in all, man, I'm just going to be continuing to hit the SCU conference every opportunity I get, whether that's an online year, whether it's a hybrid year. I'll certainly be trying to get there in person. And I really encourage people, again, if you want to support UAP science, consider joining that kind of an organization, even as kind of one of their more casual members. Again, explorescu.org is the website. Consider paying to be an online attendee. It gives you access, both in real time and for the months afterwards before they're publicly released, to the actual presentations, the video, the actual papers, things like that. It's a great group. I'm so glad to be associated with them and that they tolerate me because, sometimes I get myself into trouble, as you know, Vinny. But
oh man, it's so appreciated though, the work that you do. And again, to everybody watching and listening, the SCU link will be in the description as well, along with every other link that we've mentioned. So that, again, please do take time to go and look at these links, click on them and do a little research for yourself and see what resonates with you, because we all have a little part to play in this. And if you haven't found yours already, it's waiting for you. I promise you that. But listen, Nick, thank you so much for breaking that down for us. I really appreciate you joining me today. So thank you.
Vinny, thank you. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be on one of my favorite podcasts for years. So thank you for doing your work. And again, I'll just plug it one last time. U.S. voters, declassify UAP.org go to the Action Center. We got a great video that I had professionally produced by a top political advertising agency. Funny thing, Vinny, this is a firm that I worked with in my media technology career. They do presidential campaign ads, like very top tier races and stuff. Ironically, they moved from Georgetown in the DC area to Arlington and Crystal City in Arlington, Virginia. Their office building may literally be the closest building to the Pentagon with professional offices. So when I was going to their office when we were in pre-production and production of the Declassify UAP campaign video, like within a minute or two of getting to their office, I'm literally like, I could throw a soda bottle at the Pentagon and hit the side. And I'm like, what are the chances that I'm having this put together? Like the Pentagon, the view, I think the office that production company is actually in one of the aerial shots of the Pentagon in the ad that they produced. I was just like, this is too ironic. I love it. So I hope everyone looks at that video at declassifyuap.org. I made it so people can share it. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. Put it on Facebook. If you can even get a few more people, your brother, your sister, your dad, your mom, your kid, your aunt, your uncle, a friend of yours at work, to go to Declassify UAP and take 15, 30 seconds to fill out the form and send it to their reps, that helps. Like we want to get as many people sending out messages to their reps and covering more and more of the reps across the US as we possibly can. So please share. And I tried to do it in a way that, doesn't make you look like any specific type of person for having done that. It takes the topic seriously. And again, is really only going off of what we've officially now been told by the US government.
And because you've mentioned that video, I'm going to pop it here at the very end of this interview so that people definitely get to see it. But once again, Nick, thank you so much. And to everyone watching, as always, I appreciate your ongoing support, and we'll be back next week with another interview. But for now, take care and goodbye.
The U.S. government has finally acknowledged that unidentified anomalous phenomena, otherwise known as UAP or UFOs, are real.
We know that our service members have encountered unidentified aerial phenomena.
These objects, most often seen in the sky, but also reportedly observed in space and underwater, look and behave like many popular accounts of UFOs from the past 75 years.
Certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
While the Department of Defense has begun to declassify limited information on these anomalous objects, the vast majority of images, videos, intelligence assessments, and other UAP data remain classified top secret. Members of Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, have begun pushing the DoD to declassify and publicly release more information on what is known about UAP to the American people.
I hear over and over from many agencies the stigma around reporting and investigating UAPs prevents us from getting real answers. We can't be afraid of asking questions, and we can't be afraid of the truth.
It's time for the DoD and executive branch to level with the public about these mysterious objects, which have now held our fascination for generations. Go to declassifyuap.org and let Congress and the President know that you support declassifying UAP. The American people deserve the truth.
We should have disclosure today. We should have disclosure tomorrow. The time has come.
And can handle the truth.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the